Hey guys, welcome to Irish Medieval History. This week's guest is Denton from Denton's Tales, who'll be covering the Vikings in Ireland. Denton has years and years of experience with dealing with the Vikings and is so knowledgeable. So, without further ado, please enjoy one of Denton's.
Hello, I'm Denton, and I run the Denton's Tales channel on YouTube, which is basically tales being told by me, which is why it's called Denton's Tales, rather obviously, I suppose. And I'd just like to thank Michael and Philip for asking me to contribute to the excellent Irish Medieval History channel, which I would recommend to anyone. Now, not just those interested in Irish history, but history of the Middle Ages in general. There's always something good on it, and I'm quite delighted to be able to contribute to that excellent channel. Now, I've been asked to say something about the Vikings. So, given the nature of this channel, I'd like to talk about the Vikings in Ireland, or rather the Old Norse in Ireland, since for most of their time in this country, from the 8th century down to the Norman invasion in the 12th century, they were not Vikings. No, they were not Vikings. And by the 12th century, well, they were hardly even Norse, which is just one of the misconceptions about them in the popular mind. And believe me, there are a great many misconceptions about the people known collectively and usually incorrectly as the Vikings. Now, Viking raids on Ireland began in 795 AD, targeting principally religious institutions, churches and monasteries, giving rise to a very popular myth that the Vikings hated Christianity. They wanted to drive it from the face of the earth, and this is why they went around raiding and burning monasteries and churches and nunneries and so forth. Well, I mean, wasn't it obvious? Yes, they went around the country raiding and burning every church and monastic settlement they could find, right? Yes, they did. But, and this is a very big but, a fact needs to be checked to see what made it a fact. And in this case, the fact isn't really quite the way most people think it is. Actually, the Vikings really didn't give two hoots what religion anybody belonged to. They didn't care. They came for plunder. They came for objects of value, jewels, gold and silver, and slaves. And most of the wealth of those days was in the hands of the church. And priests and monks were just about the only people who could read and write, making them very valuable captives. The Vikings, well, they simply went where the money was. Rather like a modern burglar. He robs the houses of wealthy people, not run-down tenements with broken windows and dirty curtains, where he is going to get absolutely nothing worth taking. But while initially raiding was the sole interchange of activities between the Vikings and the native Irish, if you want to call it that, it began to change. And by 841 to 842 AD, they had established settlements. First as so-called long ports, where they could just berth and repair their ships, saving them having to make return journeys to Scandinavia or their bases in Britain. And then they became permanent places of residence, including one on the river Liffey, which they called Difflin, the name coming from the Irish Dublin, the dark pool, and that would later become Dublin. Other settlements were founded at Waterford, Carlingford, Wexford, Limerick, and Cork. In fact, most of the principal towns of Ireland were actually founded by the Norse, not the native Irish. Ireland was very much a village culture at that time, and these settlements would grow into what would become proper towns and cities. Now, the Norse. Yes, the Norse. Let's clear up that bit of terminology. Norse, Viking, because there's quite a bit of confusion there. All Vikings were Norse, yes, but not all Norse were Vikings. And many Norse, well, they started out as Vikings, but then they just became Norse again. They getting confused? Yes, well, there is this image of the Vikings, seen as almost a nationality. But in fact, they came from different countries. They had no one leader. They even fought each other as well as the Irish. They were not a unified group, but rather a scattered group of Nordic people who went out raiding. And that's what made them Vikings. But see, here's the thing. To be a Viking, one had to have a ship. Yes, you had to have a ship, and you had to go somewhere in that ship and do something or other when you got to wherever you were going. And well, that could be raiding, or it could be trading, exploring, establishing settlements in other countries. But in each case, a ship was required. See, once they were settled, as they had become by the mid-9th century onwards in Ireland, they were no longer Vikings. No, they weren't Vikings. They were settlers, villagers, townspeople. They were farmers tending fields, families raising children. They were not in ships or leaping off ships to do any of those things. So they were simply Norse, not Viking. Vikinger in Old Norse meant, well, it's kind of a vague term, but it could be seen as a seafarer, a pirate, an adventurer, one who went forth in a ship to do whatever it was they went to do in the ship when they got wherever it was they were going in it. But once they left the ships and they settled down, their Vikingness, you could say, stayed in the ships. And there was no such thing as a Viking ship. Oh, yes. I mean, this would be what people would consider a Viking ship. The fierce dragon head on the prow, the shields along the side. But there was no such thing as a Viking ship. Now, there were plenty of ships in which Norsemen and women went Viking. But the ships, they were ships. They were ships that people were going Viking in. Because you could go Viking, but you couldn't be Viking. And that's a very important point. The ships, of course, became very famous. Their very appearance terrifying the residents of seaside towns or towns that lay up shallow rivers in Britain and in Ireland. The very sight of one of these approaching on the horizon was usually enough to send the inhabitants screaming for the hills. Now, when the settled Norse were later involved in conflict with surrounding Irish tribes, they were still not Vikings. Oh, I mean, they were in combat, yes, and they had their swords and shields and all that, but, they were not leaping off ships to do it. They were simply settlers, residents of villages and towns, defending themselves against attackers. Many of them born here in Ireland to settled parents may not ever have set foot in a ship. As the time went on, the settlement and trading with the local Irish began to become the norm in many cases. Personal relationships developed. Intermarriage became common, and conversion to the Christian faith of the people they had settled among became more and more common. By the early 11th century, many residents of the Norse towns would have been Christians. The ruler of Dyflin at that time, Sidrika Olafsson, known as Silkbeard, was himself a Christian, the son of a Norse noble and an Irish princess, which was very much standard procedure by that time. The oft-quoted tale that King Brian Boru fought the Battle of Clontarf in 1014 AD to drive the evil, unholy pagans from the shores of Holy Erin. Well, that isn't actually correct. He would have had a bit of a job to find very many pagans in Dyflin by that time to drive out. And far from wanting to drive anybody out of anywhere, he simply wanted the kingdom of Dyflin for himself, regardless of who happened to be running it at the time. And, of course, he didn't actually fight the battle either. He was 73 years old, and he sat out the battle in his tent, where he was rather ingloriously, I suppose, killed by a passing Norse warrior. By the time of the Norman conquest of Ireland, or part of it at least, in the 12th century, it would have been rather hard to tell a Norse man or woman from their Irish counterparts. Intermarriage and the merging of cultures had all but eliminated any very great differences between the two, even the Norse language giving way to the Irish Gaelic. Of course, the horned helmet is yet another myth, not just in Ireland, but worldwide. In fact, very few men even wore a helmet at all. Only jarls or very wealthy men or the household troops of kings and nobles had helmets. And when they did wear them, they would have been more like what I was wearing at the start of this video. No animal accessories. Horns would have been a bit of a health and safety hazard in a shield wall. You have to duck quickly to one side, and Eric beside you now has a horn stuck in his ear. That would be a tad inconvenient, to say the least. The image of constant warfare between Gael and Norse isn't strictly correct either. What, you say? Is there nothing we believe about the Vikings in Ireland that is genuinely correct? Well, not a lot, actually. As time went on, raiding gradually ceased, agriculture and trade replacing the warlike forays into the hinterland. Alliances grew up, with Irish chieftains siding with Norse jarls to beat the stuffing out of other Norse jarls, and those same Norsemen then siding with Irish chieftains to wallop other Irish chieftains in disputes over land and ownership of things. The image of constant them and us fighting isn't really correct. It was really far more complicated than that, and very much the enemy of my enemy is my friend. The very famous Norse leader Ivar Unbeinlausi, or Ivar the Boneless, for example, made alliances with Irish chieftains so that he could leave Dyflin and go over to England to lead the great heathen army, with his now Irish allies keeping an eye on the city in his absence. Without that kind of alliance, well, he wouldn't have been able to do that. The Norse, not the Vikings, added so much to the cultural heritage of Ireland, bringing new skills and ideas and leaving a significant legacy here on language and in names. You know, many supposedly Irish names are actually of Norse origin. Grimes, Stoney, Magner, Halpin, Broderick, Coppinger, Grimes, Gaynor, Boland and Crosby, among many others. MacBurney comes from the son of Bjorn, MacManus from the son of Magnus, MacAuliffe from the son of Olaf. And Doyle is actually a descriptive name that comes from the Irish dove, meaning dark, and Gal, meaning a foreigner, the son of the dark foreigner, or the son of a Dane, who were known as Dovegal, the dark foreigners. The Norwegians were the Fingal, the fair foreigners. So the story of the Vikings in Ireland should really be seen as that of the Old Norse in Ireland. Yes, fierce raiders to begin with. Yes, leaping off dragon-headed ships. The true Vikings, as history likes to see them. Powerful men armed with fearsome axes, leaping off those dragon-headed ships to plunder and burn. But later sort of, mellowing back into their roots in Scandinavia, you might say, becoming farmers, fishermen, craftsmen, and artisans, fathers and mothers, living in a new life in a distant land, becoming what they were before they set off in the ships. Norsemen and Norse women, no longer sailing across the seas in ships, but living settled lives in towns. Oh, fierce, yes, if attacked, but not using that ferocity to gain things for themselves without having to work for them. They no longer just stole the work of others. They made things, grew things, traded for what they needed. They became a settled community, eventually blending into the landscape of Ireland almost completely. The Norse contribution to Ireland was considerable, intermingling with the native Irish and later combining with them and the Normans to become the Ireland of today. Now, if you have found this short video interesting, I hope you have. I hope you are still awake and have watched it to the end, and you want to know more about the Norse period of Irish history, or indeed about the activities of the Vikings elsewhere in Europe, then you should consider a visit to my YouTube channel, Denton's Tales, in which I look not only at the Old Norse, but also at other aspects of history, as well as some general interest topics, and usually with a bit of humour thrown in, just to keep things entertaining. I hope to see you there. In the meantime, I shall say, in the language of the Old Norse, farewell. Goodbye for now.